Gary Lineker has announced in a post on Instagram that this Sunday will be his last ever show presenting football on the BBC.
Hi everyone, some personal news. Last week I shared a post here on Instagram that contained an emoji that has awful connotations. Unfortunately, I did not see the emoji. If I had, I would never ever have shared it. The minute I was made aware, I quickly deleted the post and went on to make an apology. I would like once again to say I'm sorry unreservedly for the hurt and upset caused. It was a genuine mistake and oversight, but I should have been more diligent. I know that. I've stood up for minorities and humanitarian issues and against all forms of racism all of my life, including, of course, anti-Semitism, which I absolutely abhor. There's no place for it and never should be. So I think it's best for all concerned that I step down from BBC presenting duties altogether and not do next season's FA Cup or World Cup. The final day of the Premier League season on Sunday will be my last show. The relationship with the BBC has been long and wonderful, but it's the right time for the organisation and myself to go our separate ways.
So in case you've only been half watching this story and you're thinking, hasn't he already resigned? So it was already the case that he wasn't going to be hosting Match of the Day after the end of this season, but he was going to be hosting the FA Cup and the World Cup next season. And he's now stepping back from that. The post that led to this change was this. So it was a video of the Palestinian lawyer Diana Buttu explaining Zionism and why she opposed it. But the account that posted the video, so no relation to Diana Buttu, I should be clear, the account that posted the video had added an emoji of a rat. You can see that there. And rats have historically been used as anti-Semitic insults, including by the Nazis. So obviously, Gary Lineker correct to apologise for having shared that. But obviously, he was sharing something about Zionism because he really cares about Gaza. And he seems to be the only person at the BBC who's lost his job. The only one who's actually sort of spoken openly and honestly about what's going on in Gaza. Not the people who are, high up in Middle East coverage, but have sort of signed copies of their books from Benjamin Netanyahu on the wall. Ash, what's your take on this development?
So, firstly, the thing that I want to point out is that whenever Israel escalates its genocidal war on Gaza, the same thing happens. We end up with the news coverage here in the UK becoming utterly consumed by some kind of story about what kind of language, what kind of imagery is or is not acceptable in terms of criticizing Israel. So in this case, it's Gary Lineker. Previously, it's been Greta Thunberg and the Octopus, or the University Challenge Team, or that girl who was supposedly wearing a Palestinian flag jacket and it just turned out to be a standard one that you can get off the rack from Zara. I also remember the months of news coverage and debate about whether or not From the River to the Sea was a call for genocide. And this is, of course, when Israel was bombarding civilian areas. Children were being mutilated and maimed by the thousands, and Israel had imposed a blockade of fuel, water, food, and essential medication. So it's a funny thing that keeps on happening. Every time Israel escalates the material harms which it visits on the Palestinian people, we somehow end up talking about something else. The reason why this is because you have a highly organized, well-networked, interlinked series of groups and individuals whose sole job, whose only purpose is to flood organizations with complaints, to force them to modify their coverage of Israel, to minimize, to self-censor when it comes to that coverage because they don't want to be accused of anti-Semitism, and to subject certain individuals to suffocating levels of scrutiny to try and drum them out of public life. We've seen this happening when it comes to much lower profile individuals. You have had what I believe to be organised attempts to go through people's social media when they work at the BBC to make sure that they're not using words like genocide. Complaints get lodged. And of course, Gary Lineker, because of his prominence, has long had a target on his back. He had a target on his back when he compared Suella Braverman's immigration policies and rhetoric to 1930s Germany. He was accused of anti-Semitism then. The fact that he is somebody who quite clearly has got some, liberal progressive politics and identifies the humanity of Palestinian people meant that there was going to be something that was going to be used as a pretext to get him out of the BBC. It was inevitable. Now, quite rightly, he took down that post. But when I was trying to look for, okay, what was the post that caused the problem? I could barely see the rat. It really took me quite a few attempts to go, oh, that's where the rat is. I was thinking that it was going to be this kind of grotesque anti-Semitic cartoon that would be, really recognizable from the pages of Disturma or something like that. The fact that it was like a small emoji, I was like, I think this is a person who made an honest mistake. But there is no room for honest mistakes when you're playing a game of strategic hypersensitivity. And it is deeply strategic. Only some people, only some individuals get subject to that kind of strategic hypersensitivity. So Greta Thunberg, with an octopus that had absolutely nothing to do with anti-Semitism whatsoever, she was accused of anti-Semitism. But I can talk about individuals who the BBC didn't fire when the fault was a lot more clear-cut. So Andrew Neil, this was in 2016, he falsely accused an imam of supporting Islamic State. He didn't lose his job. The BBC just issued an apology. Jeremy Clarkson, he was filmed mumbling the N-word. He didn't lose his job at the BBC then either. It took him punching some poor, put upon producer for Top Gear. And so there is no singular set of rules which binds presenters at the BBC. What there is political convenience and a sense that some forms of racism, there will be one set of standards and sensitivity, and others it's going to be set differently. And I think that is because of this very well organized system of pro-Israel lobbying. Now, of course, I said this on Twitter earlier today, and guess what happened? I got accused of anti-Semitism. Why is that? Because this stuff about a trope, it means that if you make a fact-based observation, which is you've got institutions like UK Lawyers for Israel, BICOM, you've obviously got Labour and Conservative Friends of Israel, you've got the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, that if you say, oh, these institutions play a role in modifying media coverage and shaping the boundaries of acceptable opinions in politics, oh, well, you must be saying that the Jews run the media, which is just, it's so insulting and ham-fisted. And I do think that people can see through that now. I think people can really see through that now. But for the avoidance of doubt, not all Jews are pro-Israel advocates, and indeed, not all pro-Israel advocates are Jews. This is a system that operates in the interests, not of a race and not in the interest of a religion, but operates in the interest of a specific apartheid and genocidal state.
I think that's very well put. I want to bring up something that I think should be the biggest scandal at the BBC. So this is from an organisation called Basement Films. They say, we are doubtful that our film investigating attacks on hospitals and medics in Gaza, produced with BBC News over 14 months, cleared multiple times at all levels, containing graphic footage of attacks and searing testimony of survivors of those attacks, will be released by BBC News. We apologise to the survivors of these attacks, those alleging torture and the families of those killed. They all doubted whether BBC News would ever tell their stories. We thought they would. They still can. We are desperate for this film to be released. Please watch this space. So the context here, you might remember, the BBC released the documentary about sort of children in Gaza. There was then a controversy because one of the narrators, it turned out, was the son of someone who was in the civil Hamas administration. That apparently delegitimized the whole thing, and then it got taken down. And that has had the indirect effect that a documentary by a different company on attacks on Gaza's hospitals, which have been so severe and so extreme, various sort of interviews we've done with medics in Gaza and that have been sort of across much of the media, sort of showing how horrific the attacks on the healthcare system in Gaza have been. The BBC have decided, oh no, we can't put this out now. After they've spent 14 months making it, getting testimony from survivors, from people who've had to relive the most horrific moments in their life. And the BBC have said, oh no, a completely different documentary. They didn't reveal, or they didn't make clear that the personal relationships of one of the narrators. So therefore, we can't put out anything particularly critical about Gaza anymore. Sorry. We do know that the genocide's going on, but we think it's best to sit on this documentary. Ash, the people deciding to sit on documentaries while this is all going on, while you've got a finance minister who's saying the only reason we're letting in a sliver of food is so the international community don't stop us clearing out the 2 million people. Ideally, I'd give them no water whatsoever, and they'd all just starve to death. That's the finance minister of the country. In that situation, the BBC is saying, well, we know we've commissioned this film about attacks on hospitals, but it's too, we might get attacked if we release it, so we're going to sit on it. How's that going to go down?
Well, I mean, the thing is that, again, you've got different standards, right? Wildly different standards. So for a documentary, which is about the experiences of Palestinians in Gaza, if you've got a child who, through no fault or choosing of their own, happens to be related to somebody who's in Hamas, they're suddenly an unreliable narrator. But you've got many people in the media in very powerful positions who have been, close to the IDF or, have served in the IDF. You have individuals like I believe his name, correct me if I'm wrong, is Barak David, who works for Axios, who served in the IDF, I think, and they're allowed to cover Israel and the international relations between the UK and US and Israel to their heart's content. Right, the same standard does not seem to apply to them, whereas there is a hyper scrutiny and an impassable threshold set for Gazans and for Palestinians more generally. I think it's utterly disgusting that the BBC has decided to quietly shelve this unrelated documentary. It's entirely because of the backlash presented at the previous one. And the BBC is a highly politically contested institution. I mean, if you think there are arguments in Novara, I mean, wait till you see what goes on inside the BBC. It really is war by the means of HR. And so I think that after, that backlash against that particular documentary, and if it wasn't that kid who happened to be related to someone in Hamas, they would have found something else because there was going to be, a fine-tooth comb put through that documentary. If that's the standard that you have, you can't actually make news or quality documentaries about the experiences of Palestinians. It makes it impossible. And that's the entire point of the system of complaints. And funnily enough, it never, ever applies the other way.
And that was that great Al Jazeera documentary, wasn't there? We interviewed the producer, Richard Sanders, sort of showing how so many of the stories spun by Zaka, the sort of first responder organisation, when it came to October the 7th, so many of the sort of news reports about that came from them. And, whether or not they're good first responders, I've got no idea. But it turned out that so many of the stories they told the press could not possibly have been true. But there was no scandal about that. None of that had to be retracted. There was just all of this, all of this talk about how the most depraved, obviously the 40 beheaded babies is the most sort of infamous, but there were many, many claims that turned out just to not be possible to have happened, actually. They were completely inconsistent with the concrete evidence. But there were never any apologies. There was never anything retracted. There was never any controversy. No one said, we can't interview any Israelis anymore, actually, because we made a mistake on this documentary in October, so we'll have to shelve that until the war's over. That didn't happen. So why does it happen now?